disagreement, not about agreement. Now, I plan on doing all sorts of stuff about the New Deal, but fortunately you have someone far better qualified than me to talk about the New Deal later in the day, so I'm going to skip over a lot of it. But I think one of the most important points when Barack Obama invokes the New Deal, when liberals invoke the New Deal these days, that regardless of the empirical questions about whether it worked and what it did and all of the rest, what they're really getting at is an issue of what I would call power worship. Because if you actually start pressing liberals about why they love the New Deal, they keep changing the criteria for what was so great about it. Back when President Bush wanted to introduce some market principles and privatization into Social Security, everyone said, you're destroying the heart of the New Deal. But now that we want to have this mammoth increase in spending, everyone says the heart of the New Deal was all of this Keynesian stimulus spending. Well, whatever you want to say about Keynesian stimulus spending or Social Security, they're apples and oranges. Social Security had nothing to do with ending the Great Depression. It was not intended to have anything to do with ending the Great Depression. But what they constantly do is they keep moving the standards by which they judge the New Deal. They say, one of the great things about the New Deal was that, we were all in it together. No, we actually weren't. I mean, they say this, Howard Dean and these people say the same thing about the 1960s. It was this time of hope when we were all in it together. The 1930s and the 1960s were bad decades. I mean, really bad decades by that criteria. The 1930s was strewn with labor strife and near revolutionary ardor. You had demagogues all over the place screaming for bloody revolution and whatnot. The 1960s were punctuated by political assassinations and riots every couple months. And yet, liberals remembered at this time when we were all sort of holding hands and walking to the sunny uplands of history singing Kumbaya so they could buy each other a Coke. And the reality of it is that's where the power worship comes in. If they really loved times of peace and prosperity and national unity and whatnot, they liked the 1950s or the 1920s. But those were times when liberals weren't in the saddle and when they weren't winning the policy arguments and the cultural arguments of the day. What they really liked about the 1930s and what they liked about the New Deal was that it empowered planners to do what they wanted to do. Stuart Chase, the man who coins the phrase, the New Deal, has this wonderful line which sort of captured the zeitgeist of liberal intellectuals of their day. He says, why should the Russians have all the fun remaking the world? But I want to get back to this one last point about the moral equivalent of war thing, right? The New Deal was the signature moral equivalent of war. It was intended to be the moral equivalent of war. FDR was a retread from the Wilson administration. And I go into great detail in my book about how Woodrow Wilson was, if not the first fascist dictator of the 20th century, then the first would-be fascist dictator of the 20th century. Throws political prisoners in jail, puts thugs in the streets who beat people up, closes down newspapers and magazines, does all the things that you would think have something, creates the first ministry of propaganda in Western civilization, does all sorts of things that we would normally associate with a dictatorial figure, whatever. FDR was part of that entire project. He supported the whole thing. And then in 1932, he campaigns and then promises, when inaugurated, to reprise exactly what they did during World War I, in terms of creating war socialism where the government and business get in bed together, of controlling the means of production, of getting the big businesses and big government in bed together to screw the little guy. He promises to do all of that, and he says it expressly that he's doing it in the model that we had during World War I. He claims all of his economic authority under the Trading with the Enemy Act. And virtually the entire edifice of the New Deal was what historian William Luftenberg calls an analog of war. Just a few quick examples. The alphabet soup agencies were mostly continuations of various boards and committees set up 15 years earlier in the war. The National Recovery Administration was explicitly modeled on the War Industries Board of World War I. The Securities and Exchange Commission was the extension of the Capital Issues Committee of the Federal Reserve Board. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was an updated version of the War Finance Corporation. FDR's public housing initiative was run by the architect of the World War I era housing policies. The most famous, beloved program of liberals, even to this day, the Civilian Conservation Corps, right? Where millions of kids were put in uniforms and sent out to cut down trees and whatnot, was a quintessentially paramilitary organization. I'm not saying it was evil. It might be a good policy to do it, but it was military-style organization. The CCC mobilized 2.5 million men into what they called a forestry army. The enlistees met at army recruiting stations. They wore World War I uniforms. They transported in troop trains. They marched in formation, employing a military logo, saluted their superiors. FDR and the Speaker of Congress both touted it as a military mobilization that would make them more prepared for the next war. And as someone who had spent 4 years locked in his basement like Howard Hughes with Kleenex boxes on his feet writing this book, it was kind of fascinating to watch Barack Obama run for president. Well, during my book tour, it was like he wanted to sell more copies of my book. And I particularly loved it when he said, "We cannot continue to rely on our military in order to achieve our national security objectives that we've set. We've got to have a civilian national security force that's just as powerful, just as strong, and just as well funded." Wait for that to come. Hugh Johnson, which you can't say fast, Hugh Johnson, who was put in charge of the National Recovery Administration, oversaw the draft during World War I. He was a quintessential militaristic bully, screaming, those who are out with us are against us. One last plug for the book. When he comes into office, the first thing he does when he's unpacking his stuff is take out a portrait of Benito Mussolini and put it on his wall. And then start handing out tracts from fascist Italy to fellow members of the cabinet. The Blue Eagle, which you can read about in the wonderful pamphlet, I'm not going to go through all of that, was treated as a military insignia where FDR said you should view it the way you would view a friendly way. If you wear the Blue Eagle, it's like when a soldier distinguishes between friend and foe. That was the way they pitched this stuff. Hugh Johnson oversaw massive sort of North Korea-style rallies where tens of thousands of kids were marshaled into the streets to take pledges of loyalty to the Blue Eagle and whatnot. Since you guys are mostly probably Cowboy fans, it's probably okay for me to say this, but the Philadelphia Eagles is in fact named after the Blue Eagle. My favorite example was Jacob Majed, the dry cleaner, who was sentenced to prison for selling a dry clean suit for 35 cents instead of 40 cents the way the government wanted them to. All done in the name of patriotism, all done in the name of the cult of unity, of getting everybody together. And ever since liberalism, the modern Democratic Party is functionally a cargo cult to the New Deal. And ever since, they've been trying to recreate the New Deal, which in itself was the moral analog of war, the moral equivalent of war. JFK gets out there and says the greatest generation needs to pick up the mantle the way our fathers did for World War II and reprise that effort. The New Frontier was explicitly a moral equivalent of war argument. The Great Society and the War on Poverty was explicitly a moral equivalent of war argument. Bill Clinton, with his New Covenant, which he saw as sort of the reiteration of the New Deal, it got derailed because the healthcare stuff imploded, and he decided to hug the center and actually not get himself in too much trouble. Was at first, at least, intended to be a New Deal. In fact, just look around over the last 10 years. The clamor for a New Deal has been nonstop. After 9/11, Chuck Schumer says this proves we need a New Deal. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Chuck Schumer has a macro on his computer where any significant event, he just hits F10 and spews out a Washington Post op-ed saying it's time for a New Deal. After Katrina, there was a huge clamor for this proves how we need a New Deal or a new Marshall Plan, which is also a moral equivalent of war argument. My favorite, though, is after 9/11, when Bill Moyers wrote this piece for The Nation, which was so stony. It was like it was written by the taste tester at a lead paint factory. And he says, one thing that 9/11 proves is that we are all equal in the eyes of God, and when death rains down from the sky, and so therefore we need nationalized health care. I mean, it was really a fascinating sort of thing. And the point here is this, and I'm going to wrap up, is there is no such thing as the moral equivalent of war. War is war. Whether war is just or not just, or necessary or unnecessary, there is nothing else like war. War is a special thing. You're supposed to drop your plow and run to help your community when you're at war. You're not supposed to do it because some social planners have some vision of what society would be like if only people like you would shut up and listen. And yet you find this obsession with this desire to sort of have a new authoritarianism. Global warming is the perfect new, up until the financial crisis, was the perfect new moral equivalent of war. You had last year, Time magazine photoshopped the picture of the Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima to have them raising a tree. and it said, green is the new red, white, and blue, and environmentalism is the new patriotism. It was not a subtle argument. Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist, I will confess I am slightly obsessed with the guy. I'm about 2 notches away from following him around in a gray Buick. He's got this book out in which he argues, he has a chapter called China for a Day. How wonderful it would be if we could just be China for a day. And what this means, what he means by this is, the Chinese,